Hey everybody, if you follow me on Twitter, which presumably you all do, and if you don't, seriously, what the heck is wrong with you? But yesterday morning, I said that my one prediction for that night's debate was that Tulsi would take Kamala to the woodshed. And I didn't say that because anybody gave me inside information, although I do follow the campaign and know people within it. But it's because I can read the tea leaves. It's not that complicated. This had been brewing for some time. Going back to March of this year when I did my podcast with her, which you can go back and listen to, Tulsi made a point to criticize Kamala Harris by name without my prompting it. And there have been various points throughout the campaign where you could tell that she had a particular, I don't want to say antipathy, that's a little bit too strong of a word, but she had a particular set of qualms with Kamala Harris, which were all well-founded. It also relates to the media coverage disparities that they receive, respectively. I don't know if you remember this, but in January, the New York Times did this sort of infographic where they gave brief synopses of all the candidates who had then declared for president. And it was funny to compare and contrast because for the Kamala Harris infographic, she was touted as having this amazing history-making potential because she was so gloriously diverse given her identity characteristics. Whereas Tulsi, even though she also is diverse in the sense that she's a woman, she is a racial minority, she's a religious minority, none of that was mentioned by the New York Times in their little infographic. What was mentioned was, of course, the Assad meeting, the history of anti-gay comments when she was a teenager, etc. So it just tells you that identity points get allocated according to one's political preferences, not for any objective purposes. So the New York Times, whoever wrote that little infographic, chose to elevate aspects of Tulsi's persona and political history that ignored the fact that she possessed the same, quote, history-making potential as Kamala Harris. And Tulsi was aware of that discrepancy. We even have discussed it before. So it didn't surprise me, and it shouldn't have surprised anyone. I actually expected it, that given the significance of tonight's debate, where she now has to get, I believe it's 3 more polls at 2% to qualify for the third debate in September, she was going to try to make a mark, to leave a lasting impression. And the way you do that is to draw contrast with the other candidates. Not in a performative, superficial way, as Kamala Harris did at the debate in June in Miami with Biden, where she brought up a 45-year-old obsolete issue for the sole purpose of making a show, and the media unanimously declared her the instant frontrunner, which of course subsided, as everybody should have expected. I mean, I told you to expect that. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but it was pretty obvious that Kamala Harris would not suddenly overtake Joe Biden because the critique was ultimately hollow. Whereas it was the opposite for Tulsi. The critique that she leveled at Kamala Harris was not hollow. It was 100% substantive, and it was two-pronged. The first, which I thought was even more skilled, potentially, because it was organic. Remember, Kamala Harris brought up the fact that Kathleen Sebelius, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Obama administration, had endorsed her health care plan. So Kamala Harris is the one who brought up Sebelius. Tulsi didn't bring it up out of nowhere. Tulsi then replied to Harris saying accurately and justifiably that Kathleen Sebelius serves on the board of an entity which stands to benefit financially from Kamala Harris's healthcare plan. There's just no disputing that. So rather than dispute it on the substance, what Harris did was dispute that Sebelius had technically written the plan. So she couldn't dispute that Sebelius had a vested fiduciary interest in the enactment of the plan. She just disputed it on a technicality, that Sebelius hadn't actually written it. Well, I mean, even on the technicality, it later came out, according to various reporters, that Sebelius had, in fact, been involved in the process of drafting the text of the plan. So whether Sebelius actually sat down and wrote it herself is immaterial. That's not what Tulsi was referring to. You're being overly literal if that's what you're trying to ascribe. The fact that she was involved, Sebelius was, in the composition of the plan. So Tulsi was 100% correct. And that's an incredibly substantive criticism. It's not overly showy. It's not excessively emotional. You're not trying to score cheap points. You're pointing out a significant flaw in a policy proposal that the candidate had just touted. And then, I guess even more damning was the prosecutorial record. Kamala Harris basically has gone months since she announced her campaign pushing this conceit that she was a progressive prosecutor and therefore her prosecutorial bona fides best equip her to bring the case against Trump. Now, that's such a crock, but nobody's really called it out. I mean, you see some articles in certain, usually somewhat niche media outlets that go through Kamala's prosecutorial history in San Francisco and then statewide in California, but it hasn't really been brought up by any of the rival candidates to any meaningful degree until last night. And what Tulsi did was she shattered the mirage that Kamala has basically predicated her entire campaign on. And that's why Kamala flailed. She couldn't respond substantively, and she just really tried to change the subject, but in doing so, she proved that Tulsi had the upper hand in the exchange. And of course, it got excessively ridiculous at the post-debate spin room when Kamala decided to bring up the fact that Tulsi had met with Assad. I mean, what does that have to do with your prosecutorial record? What does it have to do with Kathleen Sebelius drafting or helping to draft your healthcare plan? Nothing. It's a non sequitur that everybody always brings up when they want to delegitimize Tulsi or they want to distract from her substantive political criticisms. And that's exactly what Kamala Harris did. You might remember that Tim Ryan, who Tulsi skewered in the previous debate over whether to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, said the same exact thing. He couldn't reply on the substance to her points on Afghanistan, so he brought up the Assad bogeyman. Now, I've been over this Assad talking point incessantly. I wrote a column about it shortly after Tulsi announced her campaign in January. I'll link to it again here, I guess. I tweeted it out last night. There is simply no evidence on the record that anybody can produce that Tulsi has ever, quote, apologized for Assad. It's a confabulation. It's a artificial narrative that was concocted by people who hate Tulsi for a variety of reasons and wanted to distill their hatred into one easy-to-use talking point. Go and find me the quote where Tulsi praises Assad, supports Assad, expresses kinship for Assad, etc. There is no such quote. I've looked. Okay? So, the reason why that talking point persists is because of the repetition. A hallmark of propaganda is repetition. You repeat the lie over and over again until people just start believing it instinctually. And many journalists and other politicians now believe it instinctually because they never really looked into it seriously. They never tried to examine whether the charge actually had evidentiary basis. They just knew that Tulsi went and met with Assad in 2017, and therefore she must be apologizing for him. And it's a farce. It's just not true. In fact, that she went and met with Assad was, I've always maintained, a marker of courage. It took genuine political courage for her to do that. She knew what the reaction was going to be. She knew that people would try to disingenuously characterize that meeting to damage her political prospects, but she doesn't care. She's sort of unique in that respect, and she uses what would ordinarily get cast as liabilities as a boon, as reasons why she's actually unique, and that bolsters her case for why she's singularly prepared to, in particular, take on the foreign policy establishment. So I thought it was a great exchange. I was actually somewhat shocked in a positive way at the reaction that Tulsi's attacks on Kamala received in the debate hall. There's a lot of applause, actually, when she brought up the prosecutorial record. And even if you read the New York Times debate roundup from last night, people who otherwise can't stand Tulsi had to concede that she demolished Kamala Harris. Charles Blow said Tulsi really hurt her. Michelle Goldberg said that the attack on Kamala is devastating. These are people who are, pretty typical anti-Trump liberal types who don't have much time today for Tulsi, but were forced to admit that the attacks that she leveled were well-founded, capably delivered, and extremely detrimental to Kamala Harris because, again, it got to the core of Kamala's entire campaign. Her entire mantra that is supposedly the reason why she's running in the first place is because this prosecutorial record has equipped her to best take on Trump. And Tulsi essentially exposed that to be a fraud. So I did predict it. I guess I'll toot my own horn a little bit. I just think that this means that you should believe my predictions because they're, I have to say, generally true. I know I'm a little haughty in saying that, but hey, this is kind of what I do. And if I was constantly wrong all the time, then maybe I'd reevaluate. But I like to think I'm more right than wrong. Anyway, that'll do it for now. Got a good podcast coming up tomorrow morning with Dennis Kucinich where we talk about these issues. Remember, he's the one who accompanied Tulsi on the trip to Syria in 2017, and he had some interesting response inspired in the debate. Please consider giving on Patreon, PayPal. That information is in the description box, and I'll talk to you later.